Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first PowerPoint of the year. This one is going to be on Congress. So since this is the first one of the year, just explain a little bit about how this process is going to work. So I'll go through the PowerPoint in some amount of videos per unit. This one will be 3. Each video will be between maybe like 20 and 40 minutes, depending on the content. Some are a little bit longer than others. But I'll go through the PowerPoint just like I would in class. What I want you to do during this process is take any notes that you want to take, write down any questions that you would typically ask during the PowerPoint, things you want to discuss so we could discuss them in class. And then when we're back in class, I'll ask you for those questions and we can have those conversations like we normally would when I'm doing the PowerPoint in class. So this just allows us to do a little bit more in class other than just PowerPoints. We can have more discussions and do more activities and stuff like that. So take notes, rewind, do whatever you need to do with this. I talk really quickly sometimes, so if I'm talking too fast in the videos, let me know and I'll try to slow down. But at least you can rewind and view that stuff again. So that'll be the process. We'll jump in with the first one on Congress. So the House and the Senate are two very different institutions that ultimately have the same common goal of creating legislation, having oversight of the executive, stuff like that. So the goal is the same, but the way that they do that is much different because their setup is so different. So the main essential knowledge I want you to take out of this PowerPoint, meaning the whole PowerPoint, not just this video, but all 3, that the House and the Senate have differing constituencies, meaning that they represent different people. And this is going to affect how they behave and the things that they do. The House's constituents are the people in their legislative district. It's a much smaller clientele than the Senate, which is the entire state. So they're going to have different goals and they're going to have different ideas about how to legislate and what to do with that. If you take someone like a senator from New York that has a huge constituency base that's very varied, they have farmers and they have people in Manhattan, they're going to have a much broader base of knowledge, and also the legislation they pursue is going to be a lot broader than someone in same state of New York that's just in a rural area is not going to really care as much about urban development or something that somebody that was had constituents in a major city would care about. So the differences in their constituents will matter a lot in how they behave. The differences in size also affects debate and how that happens. In the Senate, there are 100 people. In the House, there are 435. That means that debate is going to happen in a much different way, and we'll talk about that later. And also, their term lengths influence them a lot, maybe more than even the other ones do, today at least. The Senate's terms are 6 years, the House's are 2. So the House is up for re-election every other year. Everybody is. And the Senate, a third of them is up every 2 years, but a term is 6 years. So there's reasons for this that we'll talk about later in this PowerPoint, but those term lengths are going to have a pretty significant difference in the way that they operate. So when the framers of the Constitution came up with the idea of having a House of Representatives and a Senate with 2 different sizes, and elected in different ways, they had this idea in mind that it would be a branch that would check itself, that the House and the Senate would provide a way to make sure that only legislation that made sense and was useful and good was passed. The legislative process, as you'll see throughout this unit, is difficult. Most proposed bills, overwhelmingly, most bills don't actually become laws. They get stuck in committee or they die in the House, or if they do get past the House, they don't get through the Senate. I mean, right now, if you look at how our system is set up, we have Democrat-controlled House, we have a Republican-controlled Senate. Nothing is going to be done there of real substance because they're never going to agree on that. And that's kind of by design. The framers didn't necessarily want nothing to get done, but they certainly didn't want frivolous laws to be passed. So they created this system that separates them. So the House has rules that allow the leaders of the party and of the House to have a lot more control. So the Speaker of the House is arguably the most important person in the government besides the president today. And that's because they have pretty much total control over what bills reach the floor of the House, when that happens, where the bills go through committee, and who serves on what committee. The party leadership has a lot of power there, especially the majority party. In the Senate, that's not necessarily the case. They have to be a little bit more collaborative in the way that they decide that stuff. The Senate majority leader still has a ton of power and can kill a lot of bills. It's harder for them to do that in the Senate than in the House, though. The House allows for a lot more specialization because the people have smaller constituencies, like I talked about in the previous slide, and because there's 435 of them, The House members are going to be a bit more specific about their knowledge. They're not going to be generalists, whereas the Senate, they're representing such a large variety of people that they have to kind of be generalists, and they're going to take a bigger picture look at things. The House is also going to represent public opinion in a timely manner. Their whole deal is that they're the most responsive to the people. When the Constitution was written, the House is the only body of government, of any of the government, that's directly elected by the people. The Senate originally wasn't elected by the people, it was appointed by state legislatures, and the president was chosen by the Electoral College, still is, but it's kind of a formality. So the House is meant to be the group that is directly responsible to the people. They're the closest to the people. If you wanted to get in contact with your congressman or congresswoman, we have Bonnie Watson Coleman as ours currently. It's a lot easier to get in contact with them than it would be to get in touch with the senator, because they have a much smaller constituency. They're also going to represent local issues a bit more. If there's some kind of issue going on in their district, they're going to be able to handle that a lot more efficiently than, say, a senator would, just because the senator has too many constituencies or constituents. The House is also going to be less inclined to compromise because they don't really need to do that. Usually, when you have a majority in the House, it's a larger majority than in the Senate because there are just more people. They just need a simple majority, meaning 50% plus one, to pass a bill. The Senate also needs 51 votes, but really they in practice need a lot more because of something called a filibuster, which I'll get into later in this PowerPoint. But in the Senate, essentially, you need 60 votes in order to get legislation passed in most situations. And that makes it a lot harder for things to get done in the Senate, meaning that they have to compromise a bit more than someone in the House would. And also the House is, they're up for re-election much more often every other year, so they have to make their constituents happy. There's an analogy that people use when they're describing the House and the Senate, which is a cup and a saucer. If you think of a teacup with a saucer that, the plate that holds the tea, the metaphor is that the House is the cup where the, tea is in there. It's like hot, it's boiling, it's bubbling over. They're very responsive to the people. Whatever like issue of the day is happening that people are really concerned about, the House is going to be the one where that deliberation is going to be happening. They'll be proposing bills really quickly. And then the Senate is there to kind of catch all those things and wait and be more deliberate and see if it's actually something that's a good idea. The Senate is meant to be the more, deliberate, a store body or whatever. Like they're supposed to be the ones that make sure the ideas are actually good. The senators don't have to get reelected every other year. They're there for 6 years. So if there's some topic of the moment that everybody's really upset about, so let's say like gun control, right? We had a situation where gun control after Sandy Hook was a really big deal. In the House, they were bubbling over with that, proposing all these bills. The Senate sat back, didn't really do much with it. They're not at risk, most of them, 2/3 of them, of losing their reelection over one little issue. They're supposed to be long term. They're supposed to be bigger picture. So that's the idea behind the House and the Senate, is that they have different setups in order to accomplish different things. This is just a floor plan of the Congress building, what it looks like and where everybody meets. So you'll have over on the left the Hall of the House of Representatives, on the right the Senate chamber, and in the middle it connects with the rotunda, but then also a lot of conference rooms. That is where they meet when they're trying to hash out a bill, like if one passes through the House or the Senate and it needs to go back to the other party and they can't agree on the terms of what the bill should be, because ultimately for it to go to the president's desk, it's got to be the same bill signed by both. They'll meet in the middle and hash out some of those details. So that's what the floor plan looks like. And our Congress or legislative branch is bicameral, meaning it has two houses, which is all that stuff I just described before. So this is a chart that just shows the median wealth of each chamber, meaning like how much money how wealthy the people are, not how much money they make, but how wealthy they are. And what this shows is that the Senate members tend to be a bit more wealthy. Generally, the Senate is seen as a more prestigious position than a member of the House. So the hierarchy generally would be like President, Senate, House. So you'll often see people moving from the House up to the Senate. And then you'll see a lot of senators running for president. You can see that right now in the election we have going on, the Democratic primary. You could see that, a lot of senators are in that race more than in the House. And this is just a visual of that that teacup and saucer metaphor I was using before. The House, the passionate body that's responsible to the people and has to listen to all the things that they say, and then the Senate that's going to sit there and be the voice of reason, let things spill into the saucer without making massive changes that aren't necessary at that moment. So just some more details about the differences in the House and the Senate. In the House of Representatives, the membership 435, like I said before, apportioned by population. So the number 435 is locked in place now, but the number of representatives from each state could vary depending on how populations change. Every 10 years, we have a census. That census says the population of each state. If some states grow faster than others or some states lose people, they can lose seats in the House. So we'll have a census coming up soon. We'll see what happens with that. I'm sure that some states will shuffle around a little bit. The Senate is 100. Every state gets 2 people. I mentioned the terms of already. The qualifications for the House: you need to be 25 years old, citizen for 7 years, you got to live in the state where your district is located. In the Senate, you need to be at least 30 and a citizen for 9 years and must live in the state. So the requirements for the Senate are a bit more. The president's 35. So again, just like I was saying with how prestigious each position is, the requirements go up a little bit too. All the other stuff in here I talked about. The prestige, the Senate, like I said, is more prestigious. So that's just kind of more of a comparison of the two. So we talked last unit about enumerated powers and what that means. The powers specifically listed in the Constitution. So for Congress, and this is Congress as a whole now, 2 bodies together, the enumerated powers, they have the right to impose and collect taxes. All tax bills start in the House. They have a right to borrow and coin money. They have a right to regulate foreign and interstate trade. They have a right to declare war. The president is the commander-in-chief of the military, but he cannot actually declare war. That has to be done by Congress. They have the right to create post offices and federal courts below the Supreme Court. So there's a lot of other courts besides the Supreme Court at the federal level, and they do that. And they have a right to raise and maintain the Army and Navy. Again, even though the commander-in-chief is the president, they still have certain rights over that. So these implied powers that we talked about, because those are the ones that are specifically listed, but there's a lot of other stuff that they do that's not mentioned in the Constitution. Those are called implied powers. Powers that Congress certainly has, but they're not specifically stated in the Constitution. And those powers pretty much come from this one place, the necessary and proper clause, which says that Congress has the right to pass all laws necessary and proper to carry out all these powers that they have. They also call it the elastic clause because it gives them a lot of power, and it's very vague, and it's kind of vague on purpose because they want Congress to be able to do what they need to do in order to pass these laws and solve whatever issues the country has. The founders recognized that the country would change, and Congress would need to change with it. So the necessary and proper clause is really at the heart of what gives Congress power, and it gives them a lot of power. So the implied powers of Congress stretch pretty far, and this is just a graph that kind of shows how that all breaks down. So for example, they have the express power to borrow money, one of the enumerated powers. That implies that they can set up a Federal Reserve System of banks and do a lot more than just borrow money. They have the power to lay and collect taxes, which then gives them the power to punish tax evaders, to regulate the sale of certain commodities, to require states to meet certain conditions to qualify for federal funding, all because they have this power to levy taxes. They have, I don't need to read through all of these, you can read through these later, but they have a lot of implied power that comes from very limited enumerated powers. And a lot of the laws that you see the federal government passing that seem like things they shouldn't really be involved in, like establishing a minimum wage, for example, that seems like it really should be something left to the states. However, the federal government has the right to regulate interstate commerce, and you could argue that minimum wage would be along those lines. They have the right to regulate commerce in general. So a lot of the stuff that they do, they get from these implied powers from the necessary and proper clause. Some of it is a bit of a stretch. Sometimes the court reins them in a bit, like we'll talk about later in this unit, but generally they have a pretty wide purview of the things that they can do. In addition to all the broad powers I talked about before, the House and the Senate also have some more specific powers that they use in different ways. So the first one, and this is very specific, is that the House chooses the president in the case of a tie in the Electoral College or if there's no majority. So if the vote is 269 in the Electoral College, the House actually chooses the president. And they do that not through a standard vote, but each state gets one vote, and all of their representatives will vote within the state, and then they cast one vote for president, and then the winner, so who gets the most votes. Weirdly, the Senate actually in that case chooses the vice president. So if it's a tie and the House votes for the Democrat candidate, it doesn't mean that the Democrat and vice president will both be Democratic. So in the situation we have right now with a split body, if the House chooses a Democrat president and the Senate is Republican, they can choose a Republican as the vice president. So you can have a situation where the president wins and the vice president becomes, or the other candidate becomes the vice president. So a weird quirk that is not likely to happen. Second one for the House, all bills that have to do with taxes and appropriations or spending money has to be introduced in the House of Representatives. The Senate still needs to pass it, but it has to start in the House. And the third one is that the House brings impeachment charges to any government official, presidents or judges, or Supreme Court justices. That's something right now we're obviously going through the impeachment inquiry in the House, and what that means, as we've talked about a lot in class, is that they are formally bringing the president up on charges, and then they can choose, the Senate from there tries the president and decides whether or not to remove them from office. The process is the same for a judge or a justice, but the impeachment has to start in the House. Impeachment in the House just takes a majority, a simple majority. In the Senate, the trial, they need 2/3 in order to actually remove someone from office. 3 presidents have been impeached, or really 2, I guess, because Nixon ended up resigning. Nobody has ever been removed. So the Senate, I just mentioned, serves as the jury in an impeachment trial. They also have to have the right to ratify or approve any treaty with a foreign country. The president will negotiate a treaty, but the Senate has to be the one that actually approves it. And the Senate also must approve or reject appointments made by the president to high-level jobs like Supreme Court justices, federal judges, cabinet positions within the government, FBI director, stuff like that. So the Senate has that right as well. You saw that with the Kavanaugh hearings last year, what that process looks like, although that was maybe an atypical version of it, but that's the process. The Senate has a hearing and decides whether or not to approve of this person, and they just need a simple majority for that. So impeachment is a topic right now that is relevant, obviously, for the reasons I just talked about. So we're going through this process now, but what impeachment really is charging a government official with treason, bribery, or high crimes or misdemeanors. That's what it says in the Constitution. So treason and bribery are pretty clear, but what are high crimes and misdemeanors? Well, it's vague, and it's kind of meant to be vague. It ends up being a lot more of a political process, though. Impeachment can be really for anything that the House of Representatives feels is impeachable. Although it seems like this could be a really easy way to just that presidents could just get removed, it's simple majority, right? If you have the House that's one party and the president that's another, they could just be removed. It's only actually happened twice ever, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. And now, we're going through this process with Trump, although he hasn't been impeached yet. So I mentioned that process before. The only thing I didn't mention before is that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is the one that presides over the trial. So it's kind of like if you think of a court system, the House is kind of like the grand jury. They charge the president with a crime. In this case, it's not really technically a crime, but rather they impeach them. And then it goes to the Senate, which acts as the jury, and the Supreme Court Chief Justice is the judge. They preside over the trial. So one really important part of this unit, one important term you need to know is incumbency. An incumbent in an election is the person that already holds the seat. So if someone that's running for re-election. Incumbency is a major goal of everybody in Congress. They want to stay in office. So the incumbency rate in Congress is very high. In the House of Representatives, it's even higher than in the Senate. But generally, incumbency is a huge advantage in a re-election for a variety of reasons. Probably the biggest reason is just simple name recognition. They know the constituents know them. They're familiar with them. They probably don't know their opponent very well. So just simple name recognition. People also tend to like their representatives because they do stuff for them. Maybe they bought like a factory to the district, or they help them out with something. I mean, there's so many ways that you would interact with your representative that, it makes them more appealing. But the biggest reason is mostly just because when they walk into the ballot booth, they don't know the other person, but they know the incumbent. Another advantage that an incumbent has is something called franking privileges, which means that members of Congress can send information through the mail for free to their constituents. So if you're running an election, um, and you're not an incumbent, you have to pay a lot of money for mailers or ads or whatever. All of the stuff that you're doing to campaign costs a lot of money. The incumbents have this specific privilege. Now, they're technically not supposed to use it for campaigning. It's not a campaigning thing. It's to send information to their district. And they can do that without postage, which makes it very cheap. So, although it's not supposed to be used for campaigning, like it can be done by the campaign itself, if a congressman, a month or two before the election decided to, just let their constituents know all the stuff that's going on in Congress that pertains to them, like the great things that they've done for them in Congress, they could do that. And that, while not being technically part of the campaign, is still obviously going to help their campaign. And they get to do that for free, at least the postage. Another thing that helps them is casework, which is constituent services. So this helps people to get favorable treatment from the government. This could be things like presenting special bills for the district. It could be helping somebody out with a problem that they're having, like their Social Security card, something happened with their Social Security, or maybe they have a visa problem or something like that. That's all stuff that you would contact your representative about in the House, and they would deal with that for you. I mean, it could be the Senate too, but the House is probably doing more constituent services than someone in the Senate. And that just kind of builds that name reputation, that reputation that you're going to be helping them, that there's someone that you could trust, and that's going to help someone in Congress get reelected. More advantages of incumbency: patronage, which are resources available to elected officials to make appointments or give grants or special favors to people. They could do this again to help out the members of their districts, help get help members of their district get certain grants or government appointments that they would want. That'll help kind of build that reputation as well. They can also engage in something called pork barrel legislation, which is more of a slang term, like a derogatory term, because it is something that is maybe unseemly about Congress. Something people don't like too much on the surface, but again, if it helps their district, they like it more. So what that means is that in legislation, there will be a lot of legislation that's really big. The bills are huge and 1,000 pages, and it has all this stuff in it. And what pork barrel is that members, congressmen and congresswomen and senators will add into the bill things that help their district, even though it's not actually related to it. This is going to be money for special projects. It could be, bringing in certain, industries into their district. It's usually not really part of like what the bill is about. There are these like large, huge omnibus spending bills that contain a whole bunch of different stuff. And it'll be really specific, like building a bridge in, whatever town. And that helps them too, because then they get to go back to their constituents and say, look at all the stuff that I got, you and your district and how much I helped. And that's all pork barrel legislation. So while incumbency has its advantages, specifically for the people that are serving in Congress, like high reelection rates, ability to raise money a lot easier because they have name recognition, but also a political party behind them, the Democratic or Republican Party, that'll help them. It also scares off challengers because people know that incumbency is a strong advantage, and they might not, really good candidates might not want to waste their time with that. Also, a sophomore surge, which means that second-term congressmen tend to be reelected at very, very high rates. So there's certain advantages that, and then legislatively, the argument for incumbency and also for not having term limits is that they gain experience, they learn the process, and that if you had to have somebody, by the time they learn the process, they'd be out in the House. So it makes sense maybe to have them there for a long time so that they get to learn how it goes. Disadvantages of incumbency, though, are that because they're so often reelected, it's a lot harder for women and other minorities to take office because Congress has been traditionally male and white. So that makes it a bit harder, although that's changing a little bit, but it's still overwhelmingly white and male. There's an argument for term limits, which is that Congress, that the government really wasn't ever supposed to be a career thing. Career politicians weren't really something that the founders intended when they came up with the Constitution. So maybe term limits would be better. It gets out a lot of that, the corruption and the greed and people doing things just to get reelected. It also causes people to fall in line with the party a lot because they need the backing of the political party, and that tends to limit compromise. So there are certain arguments for and against term limits. It's something that we'll talk about a lot. Our government brings it up all the time, and it would take a constitutional amendment, but people do bring it up. So, what do you think about that? That's something I want to talk about in class. Should we have term limits? That's also a really good topic for a FRQ that I could see College Board using. So here's just a visual representation of the re-election rates in the House and in the Senate. So in the Senate, you can see they're still pretty high, usually, upwards of 80, 70%. The one dip right here in 1980 came because there was a presidential election there that year where Reagan won in a total landslide. And when a president wins in such a huge landslide, that usually leads to some down ballot voting, which means that when people go to vote, they just go down the ballot and they elect everybody from that ticket. So if Reagan is a Republican, they just kind of went down the ballot. It was a pretty big turnaround. So in some elections, you'll see that. But usually, though, the incumbency rate is quite high. And you can see, 2010, 2008, it was up near 80%. And then in the House, it's even higher. It's very, very high. The incumbency rate pretty much always above 80%, usually above 90. Several years ago, I don't remember exactly what year it was, there was an election in New Jersey for the congressional election. Every single member of the House was reelected except for one, and that's because he died, and the person that won was his son, who had the exact same name as him. So reelection rates in the House are always going to be very high. Even though Congress as a whole has a very low approval rating, people tend to not like Congress, but they like their own congressmen. They know them, they like what they're doing, they just don't like the other people. So incumbency is a huge advantage, and you'll see that over and over again in our government. So that's a good place to stop for this video. For the next video, we'll talk about the organization of Congress, and we'll move forward with this PowerPoint. So think about the stuff that I just talked about here. Write down any questions you have, anything you want to discuss, anything you want me to change about the videos moving forward, and let me know if you think this is helpful for you. So your quiz that you may or may not have next week will be on this, and then the vocab numbers 1 through 20 for this unit. So the reading is optional, but highly, highly recommended. It will definitely help you to do the reading. You really should do that. I would suggest you follow along with that, but that is optional at this point. So let me know what questions you have, what you think about this style, and if you want to keep doing this. And I look forward to talking to you about this in class next week. Thanks for watching, even though I know that I made you do it. And thanks. Have a good day.